So then we go into verse 10. Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots." Lots of hises in here. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. The Lord will not answer you in that day. Nevertheless, verse 19, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and appoint them a king." And we know that he appointed who? Saul, right, was the first. So, thank you. And I'm good because I have, guys, check out the technology. I can use my phone to move the slides. It's so exciting. Look at it. Yay. Okay. So we're going to start off with, this was like stoked. I'm stoked about this. We're going to start off with the beginning kingdom, right, before it split with Ishbosheth. I can't ever say his name right. But Saul was the very first one. You'll notice I color-coded the kings. The ones that were righteous and did good in the sight of the Lord are all green. And the ones who were evil and did very poorly in the sight of the Lord are all red. And then the orange ones are kind of the interesting ones to me, because the orange ones are the ones that Ishbosheth, we don't really know too much about God's judgment on him, but Solomon was an interesting one to me, because that's kind of he's the half and half, if you will. Like in the first part, in his youth, he actually was following God's ordinances and doing the right thing. But then when he got older is when he started indulging in the money and the wealth and the lavish palaces and such. And that always seemed backwards to me, because isn't it that when you're young is when you do all the dumb things, and then when you get older, you're wise to your ways and you figure it out by then, whatever, you know. So it's just odd to me that it's backwards like that for Solomon. And it's kind of evidence of the fact that we can have a talent that God gives us, specifically wisdom for him, that can go to waste, just completely be wasted upon your own desires and your own will. Even something as precious as wisdom, that always amazed me, you know, because Solomon, as we always hail him for his wisdom and we always look up to him for that, but really in the latter half of his life, he put heavy taxes on his people. He wasn't the best king, and he ended up really focusing more on his own rule and his own ways. And obviously that's where he went wrong. So Solomon, as much as I love him, kind of messed up there. So here's your big list, right? When you go and look at I just gave names and then color-coded them, that's all. I didn't bother with the date range of each one. But if you will notice, Judah, that kingdom specifically, after it split, went from 925 to 586. It was considerably longer of a reign than Israel's, which ended in 721 with the Assyrian captivity. So, and we can visually speaking, can see right off the bat why. There is not a single green name in Israel's king line, right? There's one orange, Jehu, and if it's the same Jehu, son of Nimshi, apparently he drives like a crazy person. And there's a verse in there about him driving his chariot like a crazy person. But The good kings on the left all came in the line of Judah, which we all know was Jesus' lineage through David. And the big thing to note, though, is that there's still that red that outweighs the green number of kings. So even Judah, who was blessed during those periods of time when they had those green kings, still fell into the sinful ways of the world, and we mostly know what that is for. But I'm going to go through and kind of talk about it at depth. So we know that God was displeased with Israel for asking for a king, like the other nations. I'm going to say that a few times in this lesson. But he gave them anyway. And there's verses in the Bible, I'll get to that in a minute, where, like in Genesis, back in Genesis, he promised Jacob and he promised Abraham kings, earthly kings, not just himself. Like he knew that I will give you kings for this nation. But there's a qualifier that Israel didn't quite remember with that promise. But the king's responsibility to the people was pretty big. It carried a very big weight. Obviously, they served as God's agents to rule the nation, and they were expected to observe his covenant that he made with his people, as well as the laws that were so beautifully laid out in Deuteronomy and other places. They had to defend the nation anytime there was any kind of war. Being a nomadic people, they were often under some kind of conflict. People were constantly trying to take over the other group of people. And then, of course, these two words right here, they had to rule with justice and righteousness. That's probably the biggest pitfall of all the red kings, especially in the house of Israel, was the lack of righteousness and true justice. Maybe someplace where Solomon came in a good way for that, particularly in the first half of his reign, would have been the just part, as we remember the baby, the women fighting over the baby, and him ruling with that sense. That was how God designed that role, because that's how God would have done it. God would have ruled justly and righteously over his people. And so we have to look at the king as some type of intercessor, not quite the intercessor that a priest is, but some kind of middleman, if you will, between God and the people. He is responsible for them spiritually. And the priests and the officials held them to this responsibility over the people and over the ruling of the land. And then usually what happened when they, got a little crazy or got a little bad is the prophets would come in and say, God is going to judge you for this. So change your ways or else. And 9 times out of 10, they didn't. But I wanted to kind of hone in on the biggest responsibility of that king was for the spiritual health of his people. Because I see God looking at that as that was his responsibility. That was his goal, was to keep his people spiritually healthy. And I think I know he had to know that he was dealing with people and not himself here. I mean, he knew in his warning, he said, this is what's going to happen when you use earthly men to rule over you. But that doesn't mean that he didn't plan to use them accordingly. He didn't plan to use them the way that he would have wanted Israel to be ruled over. And that doesn't mean that he wouldn't have used good kings to bless the nation of Israel or Judah in more cases than not. But the big issue, and you notice this, like when you're looking at the trend of when you had a good king and a bad king and the behavior of the kings, you notice the behavior of the people were doing the exact same thing, right? And it's because the kings were introducing things into the population that were allowing Israel to defy and go against God's laws at that time. If the kings were defying and going against God's laws, I'm going to do it too. Why not? If this guy who is just below God, is kind of how some of them might have looked at it, is able to do that, then I don't have any use for it either. Although I would like to point out that nowhere in any of the ordinances for how kings are to behave was God okay with this wicked behavior. As he says in Proverbs, it's an abomination for kings to commit wicked acts. For a throne is established with righteousness. again, God's bringing even anybody in a position of leadership or rulership over his people back to the obedience of to the qualities that he has designed for us to have. And then a New Testament reference. I don't know that obviously this has to do with newly saved people and a slightly different thing, but I like the analogy here drawn from it, not for the purpose of taking it out of context, but for the purpose of understanding that I think that those kings had the reason they were judged so harshly is because God saw them in this way. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Because the responsibility of taking care of the flock is that deep and that precious to God. So to take over that position meant a lot of you. And I don't think a lot of those kings really were looking at it from the perspective of how would God want me to rule this country or this nation. They were looking at it from the terms of, yay, I get to rule the nation. And the focus went back on themselves instead of on the people. And more importantly, on obedience of God in his ways. So, keep going. Yay. I just want to take a second to look at just two of them. I just picked two out of that big old list and thought, well, if that was the case, when Judah was being blessed, what did it look like? And versus what was happening with maybe a bad king in the Judah line too. I didn't want to take any from Israel. That would not be fair. But so Josiah was one of my favorite kings. Anybody remember learning about Josiah in Bible classes when you were little, like the little 8-year-old king? That was always my favorite story for some reason. And I think it's because I always loved the idea that God could use an 8-year-old to do cool things. And, you know, obviously when I was a kid, 8-year-olds doing cool things for God, that interested me because I was 8 and wanted to do cool things for God. And so he was really the last good king for Judah. There weren't any really great ones after him. He was their last hurrah. He was the last one that actually stopped and focused on what the book said and cared about it. He was always against idol worship, like from the very beginning. He's all about monotheism. Any history book will tell you that that was his big contribution to the nation, was the one single focus on God and getting rid of the pantheon that existed in the nation. He was fearful, actually, of God's wrath over him. Not just, I loved this because it wasn't just the wrath over the nation of Israel that he feared for. He was fearful over God's wrath for himself. He had that reverence that I was talking about a minute ago of the podium. Like, he had that reverence of God that brought him to this raw, knee-dropping experience. I mean, I believe he dropped to his knees and tore his clothes, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, remembering the wrong thing. But when he actually found the scriptures the way that they were written, and it was totally different from everything they had been practicing at that time. And he said, oh my gosh, this is what it should be. And so he started this campaign throughout the land where he would take the actual scriptures and he was bringing the people away from those idols and he was drawing them back to God. And the nation had a really good period of time, a really good time in history during his reign for that reason. Again, we see the leader is doing what he's supposed to be doing, and the people follow suit because he is guiding them towards the righteousness of the book. Then you have Rehoboam, pretty notorious. He wasn't the worst, though, just FYI, but he was pretty bad. This would have been Solomon's son. And there were about 3 years where he was okay. He repented. He said he was going to go to war with the split kingdoms, and God was like, no, I want this to happen. Leave it be. And he said, okay, I'll do what you say. And for about 3 years, he did what he was told. Then he kind of relaxed after about 3 years, his morals and his decrees, and started enjoying that king life like Solomon did. And he began, like his dad, heavily taxing the people. Some of us might remember from Bible study time. And actually his advisors didn't want to live absent from a life of luxury. And so they said, okay, no, you're not just going to keep the taxes as high as they are right now, like your dad put in store, but you're going to increase them and make them even more so that we can have even more. Again, seeing that worldly influence corrupt them in their decision-making process. And he went, okay, sounds legit. So then even worse than that, okay, you're going to tax the people and get them on your bad side because nobody wants to spend more than they have, especially to the government. And they told him as much. The wise men said, don't do this. The people are going to turn against you. You won't have the favor of them. And then any decision you make, you'll have conflict on your hands because of it. He didn't listen. Built pagan shrines because of his wife, who was of a different religion, and involved the people in a lot of horrendously sinful acts. Here's that dragging them away from the righteousness part. So that was the contrast I was looking to show you. And then the scripture says in Chronicles, he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. Obviously, that's going to create all kinds of problems, not just for himself as a leader, but for the people who are following him, who are not seeking the Lord as well, because they are in the same exact mind frame or mindset that he was. So, funny enough, I start talking about the road to Emmaus. Every Jewish person for a long length of the Old Testament and the New Testament really was looking for somebody to come and save them, we know, physically, because they were constantly overtaken. I mean, like I said, they were nomads. They were constantly being overtaken by other people. They wanted to be their own independent thing, and they wanted to be ruled by a king like everybody else, like all the other nations. And even in the New Testament, we still see this on the road to Emmaus, where he says, that's in, let's see, Luke 24, if you want to go there. And I'm going to start in verse 13. And behold, two of them were going to that very day a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all of these things which had taken place. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, what are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you're walking? And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days? I mean, in Christy language, it would have said, have you been living under a rock? Where have you been? Jesus of Nazareth was just crucified. And he promised us he was going to raise from the dead, but he's not yet to be here. But that's not really what they were thinking about. What they were thinking about was, and Jesus said, and he said to them, what things? And they said, the things about Jesus Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the third day since these things have happened. And then they start talking about his resurrection. But even in that time, of course in that time, they were looking for somebody to redeem Israel. And it just goes to show you that mankind as a whole has a habit of looking for the things that are right in front of them and not looking for the things that are above them. Because the things that are above them, well, for some people are not tangible. Actually, physically, obviously not tangible, but they don't seem tangible. They don't seem like they're there. They don't seem like they matter because they're not right in front of us. Sometimes I feel like I struggle with this on a daily basis. Something that I can touch and feel and control and the things, well, I have to make this phone call and I have to text this parent and I have to put this lesson plan in the computer. Like, these are all things that I can just do and check off of my list and be done with it. The things of the kingdom are far more exhaustive. They're far more deep in terms of how far they branch away from you and the lives that they touch outside of you. The things of the kingdom is an ongoing, constant thing. It never stops. There is no checklist involved in the thing of the kingdom. And that's hard to deal with sometimes because, well, you want everything to be compartmentalized and easily checked off your list so that you don't have to worry about it anymore and you can just go on about your business. But like we've been learning lately, it's work. The things of the kingdom are work. And it takes not just backbreaking work for the sake of backbreaking work, but for the sake of having that broken heart for the people who are dying and are lost in here. And Israel was taking the lazy way out in that regard. They didn't want to step up and look for the things of the kingdom. They wanted to just have their idols because that's what everybody else is doing, and they wanted to look like the rest of the world, and they wanted to check that off and move from day to day and not really have any kind of connection with something deeper and meaningful and greater than themselves. And it's in the Old Testament and the New Testament. That was the reason I brought in Emmaus, was because it's all over. It's kind of a tied-in idea. So you have to ask the question, was God willing to do away with these people because of their constant red attitudes, right? And red king attitude, led by sinful kings, or was he willing to let them have what they wanted anyway? Well, the easy answer to that is, of course. But first off, despite the fact that the king had a heavy hand in leadership, despite the fact that the king was responsible for their spiritual lives, that shouldn't have been a cop-out for the people of Israel. In fact, it's not. Everybody, all men, they are accountable to God, period. That's it. Sinful king or not. In Ezekiel 18:20, for example, he says, the person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. And then Romans 14:12, it says, so then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. We just talked about that recently in Bible study. So just to get that out of the way, yes, the king was responsible for the people, but the people were also responsible for the people, and we still are. There's nothing that we can look to that will get us out of our personal responsibility to seek the things of the kingdom. Secondly, the Lord even blessed Judah when they obeyed. So yes, it was, God did give them that king. He wanted to give them the king. I mean, he said earlier on in the Bible in Genesis, when he was talking to Abraham and both Abraham and Jacob, he said, you will be fruitful, you will multiply, and there will be kings in your line that come from you. You will bear kings in your future generations. But there was this particular attitude that they had when they were asking for a king from Samuel. And that attitude was, well, I want a king that looks like all the other kings of the nation. Not a king that looks like you, God. And this was the major problem that God had with them. Of course, despite his plan not being followed, and we see this in our daily lives, anytime we mess something up that God had planned for us, he uses it anyway. I mean, she would be okay with me sharing this, but my mom had me out of wedlock 32 years ago, and she was at a really rough, low point in her life, and she considered making a lot of decisions that would have been pretty harmful to me, but out of that mistake came a life, and I'm very grateful that I have that life. I'm very grateful that I was brought into this world to serve Jesus. Like, I'm grateful that I have that opportunity, that other people don't have. And so we see it every day that God takes those mistakes, if you will. My mom calls it a mistake. And she goes, not that you're a mistake. I said, no, it's okay. You didn't intend to. That's how it was. I said, that's something that God did in your life to show you something very, very powerful. And you not only learned from it, but you and I are closer than any human being on this earth because of it. So God will always use our bad choices, or not always, but for the things that he has a particular plan or use for. He's going to use any poor choice that we have to make something good out of it. Of course, then there are just those bad choices that stay bad choices, and the consequences we suffer from them. And Israel saw that a lot too in its history. So But the key for this particular thing was that God had to be at the forefront and the center of that. And obviously that's where they ran into the problem, because he wasn't. God knew about the kings already, as we said. This was the verse in Genesis I was talking to you about, Genesis 17:6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And God wanted to be their king, but he knew he was going to give them that. So his anger wasn't necessarily that they wanted a king, but that it was they wanted a king unlike him. And the jealousy, I don't, it's funny because growing up, I always looked at the word jealousy as a bad thing, right? Like we look at jealousy as a negative, awful thing, but our God, in another context, of course, is labeled as being a jealous God for us. It's a strong, powerful word. That means that all of your desire and passion is for this one thing, and he is jealous for us in that way. And as unworthy as I am, he's still jealous for my attention. He's still jealous for my focus and for my service and my works and my failures. He's actually jealous for when I fail, because he wants to use that. He wants to use that to teach me something about my failure and how that makes me a better person, or even, how to get out of being a terrible person, because sometimes that's what you're being, is a terrible person. But the thing that I think I wish is, and it's hard because Israel was always hearing it from Samuel, right? Israel was always hearing it from the middleman, what God was telling them. And I almost wonder if there would have been that moment, like when we as Christians, we have that really strong word from God in our spirit, of him talking to us and assuring us of something and telling us what to do, or guiding us and directing us. I wish Israel, I wonder what Israel could have done if he had just looked them straight in the eye. Probably still would have rebelled. Because there are lots of times when God just straight tells you, do this, and you don't. I do, my flesh and the spirit, they war. They do, one does one thing what the other doesn't want it to do. And unfortunately, it is. God's disgusted by that rebellion, but he's also heartbroken by that rebellion. And so when we talk about heartbreak, the heartbreak of God, I wish that we as a body, as a church, would gather that heartbreak ourselves. Because if we felt heartbroken over the things that need to be changed in our lives and over the things that need to be done for the kingdom, they would probably be done. And not just sitting there waiting to be done. So God warned them, like I read earlier, about their king being a tyrant. This king that you want. Okay, let me tell you about him. Mishpat. Is Stephen here? Oh, thank God. He doesn't have to listen to me butcher the Hebrew language. Okay. Mishpat. Ways of the king, often translated to judgment. And so God was telling them, this is going to be a judgment for you, having this king, but he is also a judge for you. He used the word lakach, which means to take, actually more than 4 times in the English, but maybe in the Hebrew it was about 4 times in the verses that I read. He's going to take everything from you, which is kind of the opposite. If you think about it, wouldn't that not be the opposite of having God as a king? Like the tyrant king, the man king, the king that you're following on earth, is going to do nothing but take from you. He's going to take your sons, your daughters, your things, your money, everything he's going to take from you. But having God as a ruler wouldn't have been that. You would have had that service to him, but it's not for the purpose of him taking anything from you. It's for him actually providing for you, back to you. Not that the Israeli kings didn't have that level for them, for the people themselves, but God is again issuing a warning and saying, this tyrant king, this king that you think is going to benefit you, is really going to make you cry out to me here in a so odd years. And when you cry out to me, I'm not going to say anything back, because this is my warning to you. You can listen to me now or reap what you sow later. And they said, no, actually literally said, no, we don't want that. We want a king like all the other nations. So even in the Old Testament, and this, you notice I keep going back and forth between the Old and the New Testament because I want to break this idea that the Old Testament is one way and the New Testament is another way. Even in the Old Testament, you see more level of freedom in serving God than serving man. That's something that is like a universal thought from point A to point Z in this book. And I'm not sure that it would have been, that would be a common thought, because you always think of the Old Testament as, the judgment side of God, and the New Testament as like the hippie Jesus side of God. And I don't see it that way at all. God's primary concern, he is supreme, above all. And all these idols, these worldly, wicked ways that everybody is far more interested in than him at this time in history, and even now, God's going to have his way with that. And he did. And Israel's history, all those red kings, the fact that Israel had all those red kings and then their reign was cut far shorter than Judah, who at least tried. They at least made an effort with their good kings. And God said, okay. And you notice that because it was like a couple hundred years where God allowed them to behave like this and gave them chance after chance after chance to repent and to turn away. And they continue to choose not to. And as we talk a lot about in here in this sanctuary, there's going to come a point where those chances end. And you have to make a decision, and that's it, the end. So, and I know this is such a basic metaphor. I mean, to a church like you guys are so well versed in the Bible, and I know I can hear myself. But the more I tried to speak on another topic, like pick something else to write about, the more God was like, no, this is what I want to be heard. Because if I have to hear it over and over and over again before I'm going to actually get it in my spirit and do something about it, then let's do it. So I know I really would have wanted something far more in depth, but God wants this from us. He wants to be the king. And I know it's so basic, but that's the problem, is that it's so basic, and yet it's like the hardest thing in the world to grasp, because we still find ourselves struggling with the flesh. We still find ourselves doing things that we're not supposed to be doing, or not even that. We find ourselves just not devoting our time in the right way to Jesus. And that's important to me. And my question, after kind of studying this and thinking about it and praying on it for a while, what would have Israel looked like if they had chosen God? Well, I hope it's what I want to look like by choosing God over the kings of this world that I allow to rule over me. And God, of course, promises a lot of things for those who obey him. In Deuteronomy 28, now it shall be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. And I don't mean blessings in the sense of things. The blessings of God are things that I consider it the peace of God. The blessings of God is the security that comes from being able to live out day to day the way that he would have me do it. And not in that constant state of worry of, did I do it right? Did I do this right? And not relying on my own strength, but allowing God to do it through me, basically. Israel would have looked set apart. And it was the total opposite of what they wanted. They wanted to be like all the other nations. But if they had relied on God as their king instead, they would have been distinct. They would have been separated, sanctified, untouchable. There's so many verses in there about when Israel was with God and when they were listening and when they were obeying, where they were on top of the world in the military-wise, right? I mean, they were a force to be reckoned with. It was because they had God behind them. They'd have been untouchable for their entire history if they had just relied on him when they should have. Secure. That's the way I think of it. Somebody not relying on God as a solid rock foundation is going to do a lot of this, lots of bending and bowing in the wind, switching from one thought to the other, not really stable in mind, body, or soul. We need to stop looking for earthly kings ourselves. Obviously, here's the practical application that goes with me and how I look at this lesson. People, addictions, preoccupations, busy lifestyles, the wisdom of tradition and common sense. That one hit me really hard. I was going through a difficult time recently, and I did my usual thing, making my rounds for all the really smart people in my life. And I mean smart people like wise people smart, because smart people, like book smart people, as smart as they are not very helpful in situations that you need advice for sometimes, because all they can do is quote you a book. Well, wise people even, there's no shame in asking wise people for help or advice, but sometimes wise people are wise, but they don't know the extent of your problem down to its roots, like God's going to know the extent of your problem down to its roots. And so going and asking a bunch of different people for like the general audience poll of what should I do with this problem is not necessarily the best way to approach my problems, because A, I'm going to get a lot of different answers, and B, that's not something I should rely on. I mean, we've relied on tradition in the church for so long, and look where it's gotten us, with a lot of bad doctrine and a lot of disconnect and separation from God. So relying on those things, and that one was kind of, the word tradition was kind of hard for me, because I am a family person, 100%. I am so all about my family, and to the point where I'm starting to think it's a bad thing, because I will seek the advice and the attention of my family before I even crack open the book at times. And that's dangerous, because my theology starts to sound a lot like my mom instead of what the book says. Also, common sense. There's nothing wrong with good common sense, but again, if you're relying on that and not on God's common sense, something that's rooted in that, then you're not going to get very far. And obviously, we expect these things to deliver us from our weaknesses and our trials, but we know now that God uses those weaknesses in our trials, and He's been speaking to me so very clearly lately that, maybe this hard time, this rough patch, was your way of connecting with me in this area of your life a little bit more, because I am guilty of compartmentalizing God at times, of having Him in all these places except this one. You can't have this one, it's mine. There's a little picture I saw on the internet recently of Jesus, and it's really silly, but it kind of fits that moment there. Jesus is holding this big old giant bear behind his back, and the bear for me represents like the reality of His grace. And the little kid in front of him has just got this little tiny bear that he doesn't want to let go of. And Jesus is saying, here, give me that. And he's got the big one behind his back, right? Like all of the goodness for you. I'm not talking about material blessings. I'm just talking about all of the things that you desire out of me, and all of the things that I want to give you are right here. Just let go of that little part and let me be the king of your life. And we don't, because we can't see the forest through the trees. We've just got this little bear. And we think the little bear is what we really want when we know better. But we still, even knowing better, won't let go of it, because it's safe, it's comfortable, and it's something I have control over and that I've put in this box that belongs to me. And that's how Israel, that's how any person, that's how anybody gains separation from God, because they don't trust Him enough to let Him, even if He wanted to give you a smaller bear that meant more or had a better connection to Him through it, and you still won't have it. But with earthly kings, that's the problem, is that we rely on these things and we look just like everybody else. We don't actually look separate. Nobody can tell the difference between us and another unsaved person on this planet when we act like that. We're not bearing our testimony or our witness. And the problem with that is that we look infiltrated, filthy, unworthy, unstable, movable by the wind in any slightest touch. The thing that I want to be ruled by, aside from the obvious answer being Jesus Christ, but his righteousness and obedience to his righteousness in seeking the things of the kingdom. Because if I can be ruled by that, nothing can, no trial, no weakness. Yes, you're going to have them. You're going to have them till you die. But none of that will ever be able to crush my spirit. Because being ruled by the world allows those things to crush my spirit. Whereas with Christ, I'm an impregnable fortress against those nations, those things that I claim as my earthly kings, that we need to defend against instead of joining, so that I can be separate, I can be sanctified. And that's the goal.